The Mid-Atlantic ADA Center is a member of the ADA National Network, which includes 10 regional centers all across the country. You can call 1-800-949-4232 or visit adata.org to locate your regional center or make contact. On slide 10, without further ado, I am going to turn things over to our guest speaker today. We're delighted to have Bill Lockard with us today, and I'm going to let him get started with his presentation.
Hello, everybody. Hopefully we're connected out there in Etherland somewhere. I made this presentation last September, and perhaps the first and only in-person conference that was still going on in Washington, D.C. And so this is the first time I've done this kind of a conference in which you can't make eye contact and you can't get feedback from the audience. So hopefully it will work. I am the program director for DEFCAN, and DEFCAN is the social service arm component of a deaf church, Christ the King Deaf Church in Westchester, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Philadelphia. So most of our work is in the greater Philadelphia area, although we have recently started work in central Pennsylvania with a large influx of all things of Bhutanese refugees who are deaf. And I'll refer to that a little bit later, but we're working with about 65 such individuals, which is a huge number of people. And of course, they don't use American Sign Language. So when they show up at hospitals and prisons and are arrested by police, or police try to render aid, it becomes a challenge. So in any case, DEFCAN is involved with a lot of different services. We have contracts with a few area counties to provide general case management. We do a little bit of interpreting, consultation, sign language classes, but the bulk of our work is actually in 3 areas of especially vulnerable deaf individuals. Being deaf doesn't have anything to do with quote, a general disability. There are deaf doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs, but the communication component and breakdown affects all deaf individuals, oftentimes during trouble, during crisis, when communication is really important. The 3 subpopulations that we focus on are deaf inmates and returning citizens, deaf refugees and immigrants, and we've worked with folks from about 30 different countries, and the World Federation of the Deaf estimates that there are 130 different sign languages, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. We are the only agency in Pennsylvania, and we're small, that has any dedicated services to deaf inmates and returning citizens or deaf refugees. Just to give you an idea of the services that are available in Pennsylvania, which is a pretty populous state. So the more rural you are, the less services are probably going to be available. The other service of subpopulations is that we work with deaf-blind individuals. And we provide what are called SSP services, which basically is a communication assistant and guide. Will take somebody to the store, to the doctor's office, not to interpret, but to assist in getting around, doing shopping, getting medicines, et cetera, et cetera. And we work with about 30 deaf-blind people in the greater Philadelphia area. I myself have been working with deaf individuals since about 1979, which I think is about 42 years now, and started at the School for the Deaf. And then after that, in which, and the comparison is that in a deaf school, you've got deaf counselors, deaf teachers, and deaf superintendents. And so there really is a can-do attitude. There is communication is at the height of what goes on. Everyone is included at everything. You have deaf cheerleaders and deaf debate teams. But what I found when I moved into the community is that deaf people oftentimes are very isolated. Of course, they've structured their lives so that there's a deaf bowling league and there's a deaf club and deaf softball leagues and deaf ladies groups and deaf sewing groups. But in the end, when you're in your home or you go to the emergency room or a policeman stops you, you're not with those groups, you're by yourself, and communication becomes the chilling factor in deaf individuals' lives. So my experience covers the gamut of human services in regard to criminal justice. My work as an interpreter and social worker through the years has brought me into many, many prisons. I've worked for 24 years as a volunteer, providing weekly classes at Graterford State Prison, and now it's called Phoenix, in which we work on decision-making skills, but mostly it's there to allow the deaf individuals, the prison staff, and others to know and to see that communication is possible, that there is someone there to assist, not with interpreting, but to be with individuals and to allow them to try to provide access to as much as possible. I guess I should be asking for next slide. We should be on the communication slide. Okay. What I've added to this, because this is so important, is that I'd like those of you who are out there, hopefully you really are, to imagine yourselves flying to Russia, landing. You had something to do there, criminal justice, you were going to meet with some people and you expected to have interpreters there, but something went wrong and you yourself were arrested and put in jail. And of course, don't know Russian. And so things are getting really tough. You can't lip read it. Somebody writes you notes, that doesn't help. And obviously you can't understand anything anybody's saying. Now, over time, you're probably going to start catching on to what the Russian words are for yes and no and chow or fight or shower. Maybe. It's going to take time, but there could be weeks, months. And of course, if we were during COVID and people had masks and everything was muffled, it would be more difficult. Now you get sick. Somehow or another, you contracted spinal meningitis. You wake up the next day, terrible fever, and by the end of the day, you are completely deaf. Now, imagine your situation. No friends. You can't understand the counselor, the guard, the CO, your unit manager. You can't understand anything at programs. They can write things down you can't understand. They can provide captioning in Russian. Doesn't do a whole lot. If you can actually imagine that situation, you may get a glimpse of the horror and terror that many people have written about for deaf individuals who are thrown into jail. No matter what they did, innocent or guilty, the terror is still there. The isolation is still there. And when you think about communication, it's not really just, as I said, chow, eat, shower, but communication is intricate. It has all to do with empathy for others, being able to share feelings, listen to stories. It allows you to understand your world, communicate, gain friends. It's the essence of everything we do. And so without that communication, you're stuck. And that's what the deafness does. It makes all of those important elements of communication impossible to access under most circumstances, even in the general world, and certainly much more difficult when you're incarcerated. Now, of course, deaf individuals are not all the same. So you have deaf individuals with mental health problems and intellectual disabilities, drug and alcohol problems, physical disabilities, no legs, no arms. How do you sign? Older inmates who are deaf, older inmates who were hearing, who have now lost their hearing, so they have no sign language, but now they can't hear. They can speak. So you've got a wide range of individuals to try to serve. And when you think of no matter whose job, whether it's the arresting officer, a lawyer, a parole or probation officer, or a CO, anyone in the criminal justice system, it's about communication. Everything, you go here, you go there, let's sit down and talk. Here's a program on anger management. It's all based on communication. And when you take the communication away, things get difficult. Next slide, please. A couple myths. I say lip reading or speech reading, you can, and no, you can't. So I don't know how well you can see me. I'm trying to put my face towards the camera, and I'm going to say, so I'm gathering that most of you probably said, oh, lip reading works. He just said, I love you. Or I'll try another one. You're going to say, yeah, it's not so bad. He said, how are you? So now I say lip reading, speech reading doesn't work at all. And it doesn't work at all because now I'm going to continue with my presentation. Okay, so I hope you got a tiny taste. The only people who really lip reading can work with are people who have some hearing. You keep the message very simple. You supplement it with some sort of written information, and you're very clear. You make eye contact. Without eye contact, you obviously can't have a mask. So I'm going to also give you a little test now. I'm going to give you a name of a popular person and see if you can lip read it. Third time. The name was Teddy Kennedy. And if you say that word, 5 syllables within those 2 words, none of them are visible on the lips. Teddy, the tongue is going up and down. Kennedy is in the back of the throat. Nothing is formed on the lips. Now, make a sentence with 30 syllables. They say 30% of the syllables are even visible on the lips. So you got 60%, and of course those syllables are all mixed and matched. So it doesn't work. It is not a reliable substitute. Then we come down to the deaf and dumb. Many people I hear prison workers all the time talk about the deaf and dumb guys. Go work with the deaf and dumb guys. Dumb used to have a connection with inability to speak, but lots of people who are deaf and hard of hearing speak. Deafness doesn't affect the voice box, so there's no connection, and it certainly is no connection to dumbness up here. There are tons of deaf people with PhDs in every possible field. So hearing loss doesn't necessarily affect one's intellectual ability in any way, shape, or form, though there certainly are people with varying degrees of intellectual abilities who are deaf. What somebody is called is up to the individual. Most deaf people that I know call themselves deaf and don't see it as a disability. They call themselves deaf as someone would call themselves Irish or Hispanic. It's seen more as a cultural thing because people are connected by their language. Someone may want to be called hard of hearing or hearing impaired. A lot of deaf individuals don't like being called hearing impaired because they see that as identifying them as what they are not. Hearing people are good. You can't hear, so you are hearing impaired. And certainly if you just saw that as a relational term, that's fine. And I would suspect most of the people who are watching today are deaf impaired. You have no idea what's going on. And I suppose if you were just called deaf impaired, you wouldn't think much of it, but it is pejorative. It actually sets you up as what you're not. You're a hearing person. You speak, you hear. These folks are deaf people. Now, maybe that doesn't seem like much, but names mean a lot. Regarding sign language, I mentioned there are 130 different sign languages in the world, estimated. So no, sign language, you know, if you get a person from Bhutan or Italy or India or China or Taiwan and they get plunked into your jail or they get arrested and you grab a American Sign Language interpreter and you put them in front, and we'll get it. They may get certain gross gestures. You want to eat? Sure, those kinds of things. But if you're talking about reading their rights and what their options are, it doesn't work. You can write it. You could even write it in Chinese, or you could write it in English if the person was. But many deaf individuals, especially those who end up in custody, oftentimes are not literate. They have minimal reading and writing skills. So writing out things like, you have a right to remain silent. What the heck does that mean? I'm deaf. I don't know what that means. So a lot of the written information and communication can be misinterpreted. Many people within the human service field and education field feel that deaf individuals have certain tendencies that I noticed that, they come to family gatherings and no sooner have we been there for 15 minutes than he's all red in the face again, complaining he doesn't understand. He's very impulsive. And when he's not angry, he's very introverted. He's not involved with anybody. Well, there is no connection that anyone has ever found, any psychologist or psychologist who has found that deaf or folks are any more impulsive, explosive, or introverted than hearing people. And again, it's a relational situation. Were I to take any of you hearing individuals and put you in a group of 30 deaf individuals at a family dinner, as it were, and you kept saying, what did he say? What did he say? And we said, later, we'll tell you later. You would find that you would be initially very introverted. Then you'd start getting angry. You'd bang the table, throw the food across the table, and walk out of the room. Or you wouldn't come back. You'd show up at one family gathering where everybody else was showing up at many. So the diversity of deaf folks has to do with how much hearing they have, a little bit, when they lost that hearing, whether it was complete or partial, what kind of families they grew up in, whether they were supportive families, whether their communication was at the top of their list. 90%, it's estimated that 90% of deaf people, deaf children, have hearing parents that don't sign. Now, it's hard to believe. I came from a family just this morning, a family of 10 people, and we work with many, many, many. It is the rule that mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters cannot communicate with their brothers, sons, daughters. Now, what does that do to an individual growing up? We're not going to get into the psychology of how they may have committed a crime or been accused of some crime, but imagine the dynamics of a family and the workplace, etc., where people are not involved. And it happens to be the dynamics of the situation in almost all prisons. Next slide, please. So if faced with deaf and hard of hearing people in any situation, including prisons and courts and arrests, there are lots of accommodations, but again, one size doesn't fit all. So one needs to ask the person, how do we communicate? What works with you? What do you need? They may have a hearing aid and you may think that, okay, with the hearing aid and the battery or the cochlear implant, whatever, now they can hear. Well, that isn't necessarily true. Hearing aids and cochlear implants do not cure deafness. If I was to say something not very intelligible I want to get that. You really didn't understand what that was. And if I was to give you a hearing aid, sometimes all hearing aids do is amplify that. So then you'd hear, I want that. Well, so it didn't really help. You can't depend on, because you gave someone a device, that it was going to fix the communication. So there are special phones that are now available for deaf folks. There's video phones, just like here, in which deaf folks in jails can call other people who have video phones and speak with them directly in sign language. Or they can, if they call a number that is not a video phone, it automatically will connect to a 24/7 interpreting service, national interpreting service, in which they will go to an interpreter who will voice to the hearing person, who will voice back, sign. So it's just like using an interpreter, and it's available 24/7. So deaf individuals with video phones, not necessarily inmates, can call for pizza, they can call their friends, they can call the doctor, et cetera, and vice versa. All those community people can call back, and they will get an interpreter who will then get the deaf individual on a phone. But if you look at the picture of deaf and hard of hearing people, there may be 5 to 10% max who are deaf and use sign language, and the other 90% are hard of hearing at various levels, and they don't use sign language. So they speak, and then they need some kind of device communication service so that they can understand what's coming back. Today's program is captioned. You're all familiar with captions. And there are phones in which someone can either type their message out if they can't speak and get a typed message back, or they can speak as I'm doing now, and if I couldn't hear and you were to respond, you would get a typed message or a captioned phone back. Amplified phones. Some people just need a little boost, and the amplification does make things more clear. And then there are people who are deaf and blind, and they can use basically a Braille machine, smartphone, connect to a smartphone kind of apparition or a computer, which will then put it on a Braille, and you can read the Braille and type your message back and read it back. Now, that's a very rare thing. Sign language interpreters and CART. Most of you know what sign language interpreters are, but you may or may not know that you can get such interpreters either in person or remote. All of us are probably much more familiar these days with getting remote interpreters of all kinds, because we remote everything now. And remote video relay interpreting is fine. It's excellent if someone comes into an emergency room and you can have instant access. The problem is there are many deficiencies. The internet breaks up. People freeze. So I was going to have a heart, and then it freezes, or it totally disconnects, or it comes back and now there's a new interpreter on who wasn't part of the conversation that led up to the diagnosis and the treatment, and now you're being discharged. And so there's a disconnect that way. You have someone who is in the medical facility and they're flat on their back. Usually remote interpreting comes in on like a cart, basically a laptop on a cart, and you can just position it somewhere that it's very easy to see. There are various institutions who rely almost entirely on remote interpreters because they're in rural areas, etc. And they're okay, but they have to go to a specific room that has that specific equipment. And of course, there are programs and services that are offered all over the prison. And so obviously you are limited to that one room, that one cart situation. So live interpreters are able to move around the prison. They're able to get down on their knees if someone's laying on the ground. They're able to lean this way, lean that way, if doctors and nurses are surrounding a table and giving intravenous, et cetera, et cetera. So one needs to have All prisons should have 24/7 access to emergency remote interpreting, but they also always should have contracts with in-person agencies. So obviously, prisons and jails need to be in that are going to be designated for deaf or hard of hearing folks need to be in areas where there are resources. And I say here, how much access is enough? The Americans with Disabilities Act is very clear. Everything, if it's offered to another inmate, they get phone calls. Deaf people need a phone call. You got to figure out what kind of phone is going to make it. They have access to phone calls every day. You can't plunk it and put it in the unit manager's office and say, yeah, we got one. And sorry, I'm not there on Saturdays and Sundays and evenings. You only have to do it when the counselor's in. That's not equivalent access. If inmates can go to anger management and sexual offenders classes and movies on Friday nights, you name it, religious activities of 5 different varieties, 25 different varieties. Every single program and service needs to be accessible. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy. That doesn't mean you can do it all the time, but the goal is that, and that's the obligation and the requirement of the law. So you got healthcare programs, your work programs, meetings, socials, and none of that means a hoot if there's not awareness by the staff and training as to how all those things are accessed, how to be sure those contracts are in place, how to make the equipment accessible, how to make sure it gets repaired and brought back, or there's a backup piece of equipment. And one that is oftentimes forgotten is that if you have outside contracts like hospitals and doctors, all outside contractors must sign contracts that say we will be completely accessible. And that's the responsibility of the prison to make sure that if you're going to send one of the people you care for out, that you confirm that they're ready. Their interpreters are going to be there, whether it's remote or whatnot, but all that needs to be thought through and taken care of ahead of time. I just want to take a quick look at 2:30. We're going to try to stop this at 2:45. So think of any questions that you might have. I'm blowing through a lot of information. Next slide, please. In 2019, in conjunction with discussions with the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, we were allowed to visit the 4 institutions, 4 state jails in Pennsylvania that house deaf and hard of hearing individuals. They've tried to clump them in the east, central, and western Pennsylvania, with one of the 2 state facilities for women in central Pennsylvania being designated as the prison for deaf and hard of hearing women. So we were there, talking with staff, talking with inmates, being shown what they have, et cetera, so that we could see for ourselves what they had, what was working, what was not working. And what we found is not one had ever had any kind of captioning at their institution. Now remember, 90% of the folks who are deaf or hard of hearing are hard of hearing, later deafened, and so they don't use sign language. But they could greatly benefit from the kind of captioning you're seeing here. And of course, all of this is accessible both by in-person stenographers, CART people, or remotely. Just as now, a captioner, a CART person is in their office or living room someplace with an earbud listening to this conference, typing it all in, and it's coming up instantaneously. And that can be in every program in a prison system. We also found that of the 4 prisons, 3 rarely used interpreters. At 2 of the prisons, the female prison and the rural prison in Western Pennsylvania, their primary interpreters were other hearing inmates. with sometimes they say, oh, well, Sergeant Joe, took a sign language class once, so he helps out when those inmates aren't around. Now, I don't know if you know much about the ethics of interpreting and the complexities of interpreting. What could go wrong possibly with a hearing inmate interpreting confidential, financial, sexual, medical information for another inmate? Any possible areas there for extortion, not to mention the fact that there's no privacy now. An interpreter's job is to communicate not a bit of the message, not a little bit, not what you can, I don't really fingerspell, but I know some basic signs. No, it's a full and complete language, very intricate, and the full message needs to go. If it's coming to me in sign language, I need to be able to voice the entire thing, no mistakes, nothing. And if it's voiced, I need to sign it all back. I have to be completely neutral and confidential. There's a lot of very personal information that's going back and forth. And we talked a little bit about the only one of the prisons, and now I believe 2 have started to use remote interpreting, even though they had no in-person actual certified interpreters coming into the prison. They were in a rural area. There's only 2 certified interpreters in that area, and those interpreters are completely overwhelmed with hospitals and many other requests. And one of the last things they want to do is drive a long way to go into a prison. It's not nearly as comfortable, and they don't have the time. So prison dedicated services for deaf and hard of hearing inmates need to be in areas where there are plenty of resources. Next slide, please. Although each of the 4 prisons had video phones, and 2 of them had amplified phones, none of them had caption phones. So none of the hard of hearing people, or hard of hearing people that couldn't benefit from the amplification, had no way to make phone calls. Now remember, 90% of the people who are deaf or hard of hearing are hard of hearing. So phone calls are cut off. You're already isolated. You can't attend a lot of programs, and now you can't even make phone calls. Some had other assistive devices, everything from vibrating watches to digital signages on the blocks. But the 2 places that had good digital signages, deaf inmates say they never use it. And what would they use it for? They would use it for saying, Joe Blow, you got a visitor. You'll have to tell me what are the announcements on a block. Dinner, wake up, lockdown. I mean, there's a million things that are probably said in the box out for the block. And if they're not put up on the signage, deaf individuals, again, are left out, not knowing, and a certain kind of anxiety, frustration, paranoia builds as one is left in isolation. And the fact that, no staff had any level of special training or experience with deaf individuals that we met in the 4 prisons before working with this population. None of them. So the Department of Corrections didn't have any standard to say, let's try to get some basic information to any COs or unit managers or psychs, whatever, who are going to work with this population. We've set up a deaf center here, 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 and here. So we should provide some kind of general information, like the lip reading thing, this conference, something to cover information. Instead, without that information, you have COs going up to the guard, going up to deaf inmates throughout COVID with masks, sharing no information, but probably in their mind, figuring they have communicated what they needed to communicate, and now the responsibility is on the deaf person who saw nothing, heard nothing, to be sure they followed that request or command. And the individuals without training and knowledge and background are also the ones who are responsible to be making decisions about what accommodations to provide. Well, if you don't know what the accommodation possibilities are, how they work, when they should be done, then oftentimes they're denied because they're not seen as that important. All 4 prisons said that they had never provided an interpreter for any deaf individual at that time. This is over a year and a half ago, for anybody in restricted housing. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, visits by chaplains, visits by psychs, COs all the time, no communication. And one of the bigger things is that the state system doesn't talk to the county system, prison, jail. State parole, county parole doesn't really communicate together either. So what we have is deaf person gets arrested, they find out maybe that they need an interpreter for court. That information is not passed on to their next stop at the county jail where they're awaiting sentencing. So there's no interpreters provided there. Then they're sentenced and they move to the state jail. The information that should have been passed on all along doesn't happen. There's no official intake and evaluation or communication plan. So these were all findings. Next slide, please. Additionally, what we found is that there's usually a 2-tiered system. Just like everybody, you have to apply for a program. But for deaf, hard of hearing folks, you have to apply for the program and then say, wait a minute, first of all, we have to see if we can have an accommodation. And so even if the person gets accepted into a program, oftentimes they don't get the accommodation, so they don't get access to the program. It's either, oh, the contract just lapsed, we can't provide that, you can't bring an interpreter in, it's at the other end of the prison, we can't have this, we can't have that. And because of the lack of preparation, there's either a delay or a denial. So you can't have a 2-tiered system. You can't say, okay, if you want an accommodation to get into that program, you have to talk to the lieutenant. The lieutenant has to pass that up to the state has to consider it, look at the finances. You can't have a 2-tiered program because that's really just denying access. And it always comes back down, you're either approved, program's over, or you're not approved because of the accommodation. So the system is set up for folks to fail. And what happens is that oftentimes deaf and hard of hearing people just stop asking to be involved in programs because they're denied, they're denied, they're denied. Next slide, please. So I don't know if any of you got even an inkling of what it might have felt like to be deaf in a Russian jail, but it's not any different from being deaf in a United States jail. You're isolated. Oftentimes you can't, because you don't have accommodations, you can't fulfill your required programs, so you end up just serving out your max, or you go longer than you would have. The time is more difficult because of the isolation, anxiety, and oftentimes brutality. You're less prepared to return home because now you don't have those programs that were supposed to be building and preparing you to go back. And you may be more likely to reoffend because you might not have understood the problems with your crimes. You might not have resolved some of those issues inside because you haven't been able to get the help, the counseling, the teaching that would have made that work. Next slide, please. So this is what we found. In spite of 24 years of advocating in various prisons and seeing almost no changes. Keep in mind that the Rehab Act of 1973, which required all prisons, or at least state and federal prisons, to be completely accessible, completely, not partially, have a phone here, all programs and services, 1973, 50 years ago. ADA is now almost 30 years ago. And although there's been incremental steps of improvement and increased access, it's minimal. It's nothing compared to what it's supposed to be. And we believe that because there's no expertise in the system, there needs to be expertise. And Our belief is that the only way to make the system work is to hire a deaf, hard of hearing specialist ADA coordinator. Most states, most jails have an ADA coordinator, and most of them don't have a clue as to specific complex issues in regard to hearing loss, the resources, the changes, the technology. And we believe that every state should consider having a specific ADA coordinator whose only focus is on deaf and hard of hearing people throughout the system. Because when a person is released from jail, they haven't been prepared and participating in programs. They then get plunked into parole and probation. There's no accommodations provided by them. And there's no accommodations provided in any halfway houses or any other living situations. So we believe the only way to make a system work is to have a deaf, hard of hearing ADA coordinator specialist who works with all those systems, is funded by all those systems so that it's not a huge cost to any particular, and they're given authority to make decisions. Decisions are made ahead of time. The contracts are in place so that when somebody shows up at X county jail, all they do is bingo. It's all been made. There's a boilerplate set of policies and procedures that are passed around. And if, because of the turnover of staff, there's a problem, there's always someone within every single department who knows who to call. And that person has the most up-to-date, thorough knowledge. It's the only way something's going to work. There have been lawsuits in Virginia, Washington, Oregon, and quite a few other states that have Virginia that have made a whole list of requirements for jails to follow, and they just fall by the wayside because they don't have the critical link that can keep them going, keep equipment moving. Now, what should a person need? Well, I think, in my own personal experience, that if you don't provide, offer accommodations to an inmate for at least 10 hours a week, that includes religion, required classes, optional classes, work, interviews, meeting with the unit manager, going to medical. That's per inmate. Now, they don't have to take them, but it'd be easy to give 10 hours, make sure it's all budgeted. That's for CART, for interpreters. Then they're not going to access. They'll just figure they won't have it. You've got to offer it and have it on the table and budget for it. Next, also get rid of the whole two-tiered accommodation application thing. If a person qualifies for a program, there should not be any question that they will participate because all those other accommodations are in place. It has nothing to do with the finance office, has nothing to do with the state level. It gets approved, pre-approved in their communication plan. John Doe is deaf. He needs an interpreter in order to participate. He's here. He's got 10 hours a week. It's all set in advance. Next slide, please. The costs. This is the boogie boo. Costs for interpreters can be anywhere between, and CART, captioners can be anywhere between $50 and $100. The ADA coordinator specialists for deaf and hard of hearing folks can be $200,000 with salary, benefits, traveling throughout the state, working with all the county jails, working with the parole and probation. So it's a significant investment. If one doesn't make the investment, then one is basically just saying these folks aren't important. They're in jail. We're not going to, we'll throw a bone to them every now and then. But oftentimes, especially with all the other work and involvement that staff in jails are involved with, the small population of people will be ignored. Next slide, please. Running out of time, so I want to get to questions. And so my final comment is that because there is so much going on in the criminal justice system, there's so many special needs, it requires specialists, or those folks with special needs will just always fall to the bottom of the barrel and access will not be provided. So that's that's a wrap on that, and there's at least 10 minutes left, I believe, if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Locker. That was just a lot of great information. And again, folks, if you have questions or comments, please type them into the question panel. And we have one comment in there, and I think this actually was put in back when you were talking about speech reading, lip reading, and how it really is not a reliable, form of communication typically. And this comment, I appreciate this comment because it made me think about an issue that we often talk to folks about in the ADA Center, and that is about the covered entities, the law enforcement officers and the prison officials and the doctors and so forth, where they have an equal interest in making sure that communication is effective, that all of these methods and technologies and things are not just for the benefit of the individual who's deaf or hard of hearing, but communication, it's a two-way street. It's about understanding and being understood. And so this individual's comment was, there are a lot of folks out there, sometimes deaf and hard of hearing folks, who will bluff about understanding. They may act like they are understanding, but they aren't always understanding. They may not really fully understand. And so the comment was, you have to kind of watch out for that. So I thought that was an interesting comment about that sort of issue.
And it's the same with sign language. A lot of us hearing folks, we nod and bluff that we understand what deaf people are saying. And of course, others watching will assume that I did get that because we're all a little bit off this is not what we do. And so now I'm working with a person in another language. They're nodding that they understand, and I'm nodding that I understand. And there's an awful lot that gets missed in between. So, when in doubt, verify, ask, what's your sister's name? Something that maybe you have a record of. Where did you live? Did you grow up in Philadelphia? Something that you can test. Is this working? How far is it working? And do that throughout, whether it's an intake or a medical exam, just a discussion about somebody's family. Something that you can verify, and that will give you a judge as to how much communication is really working.
That is a great tip, and that is a great point about folks, when we get a little bit uncertain, we may have that tendency to just nod and smile and, yes, I'm going along, but I'm really not getting what's going back and forth here. So that is
and I would add that it's a way to empower those who don't sign, who are using, quote, interpreters. Always have something about the individual and see if it gets through. So you're working with let's say you're using an inmate, okay? And you say, how many sisters do you have? Whatever it is because you don't know sign language. But you can test interpreters. You can test a CART feature. Use what you know, and you're the guard, you're the psychologist, you're the doctor. What do you know? And then don't just assume that the language is working. Constantly verify and confirm the ability of the interpreter, the ability of the tool resource you're using to assist with communication.
That is another great tip. So many of us, if we're using an interpreter between a language we know and one we don't know, we have no way, or that's the way we think about it. I have no way of knowing if that interpreting is accurate. They could be saying, I'm saying, who knows? So that is a great tip to sort of test.
And if one of the rules of an interpreter is to communicate everything. Once you're in their presence, everything you say, it's signed to that person. And if they're signing, that interpreter better be talking, right? So you can test them. Hey, listen, this is just between you and me. I'm just wondering, where do you live? Well, if that interpreter doesn't interpret that, and they exclude, if they make the decision what they're going to include the deaf person in, then you've got a problem.
That's a problem.
Or if the deaf person is, well, he's just talking about his family and you're going back and forth. We ready for the meeting now? No.
Yeah, that's not what we're here for, right? Exactly.
Well, it's a way to be in control. You should be the one to be in control, and you can be. Whatever the other resource to help with the communication, you can stay in control. Police officer on the street, right on through.
Well, that's some great information. We just want to thank everyone for joining us today and remind folks that you can contact us here in the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center or your regional ADA Center, wherever you may be, by calling 800-949-4232. If you have a telephone number, area code, that thinks it's in Delaware, the District of Columbia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, or West Virginia, you will get a hold of us here in the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. If your telephone number belongs to another state or territory in the country, you will get one of our sister agencies. If you have specific questions about today's program or any of those kinds of issues, you can call us directly. If you're outside our region, at 301-217-0124. You can email us at adainfo@transcend.org, and you can visit us online at adainfo.org. This is a comment. My local police has no deaf supports or services for defendants or victims. So that's more of a comment, but you may have something to say about that.
Well, I mean, the criminal justice system doesn't start with, arrests and incarceration. It's all the services. It's victims. It's the same situation. We've worked with many deaf women who need to get out, and where do they go? It's hard to go to a domestic violence shelter, because part of the whole thing is for women to share, to be engaged. And usually domestic violence shelters are nonprofits, and they say they don't have interpreters. And so the women are isolated even in the situation where they're asking for help. Crime victim services, domestic violence, counseling. So it is a challenge. I'm not saying access to low incidence population is easy. It does require a lot of planning, a lot of thought, a lot of budgeting, which is why you have to have someone leading the effort and giving the authority to do so.
Now, we have had a few more questions come in here. One person is asking that you cited a study that was done in Pennsylvania prisons. Was that something that was published? Is that something that you could provide a link? Is it online? Could we, get a hold of that information?
It was not a study. The Department of Corrections asked if me in particular, would be able to go to these prisons and talk to people and come back and give them an assessment. And that's what we did. So we were able to do all that interviewing, and it really was in letter form. This is what we found. This is what we would recommend, et cetera, et cetera. So there is no link. There's no formal study. If people want to contact me, I can send them the list of accommodations that we came up with and any of the information we shared with the PA Department of Corrections.
We have another question in here about, are you aware of any law enforcement agencies in Pennsylvania that are using VRI in their patrol units?
I am not. I can't imagine. It would make sense, but I would think it would be pretty awkward to be trying to, protect and defend and serve and then going to your car and using. It could be helpful, though, if it's a relatively peaceful situation and you do have the time. Officers don't always have that kind of luxury, but it's an interesting. They could call FaceTime, and they can call, there are ways. A lot of deaf individuals have video phones on their smartphones. So a deaf individual could actually call the police officer and there would be an interpreter on the phone. So there
People are doing some creative things with technology sometimes, aren't they?
They are. They are.
Well, unfortunately, and we did get a few more questions here just in the past few minutes, and we are at the top of the hour, so we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But perhaps if folks would like to give us a call in the center, and we can maybe connect folks with some additional responses from you, Mr. Lockhart, and try to help folks find some additional information about this topic. We really appreciate your time today and all this great information that you shared with us. And thank you to everyone out there in the audience who's joined us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.